This is the audio recording for Microsoft A Materialist Approach for February 20, 2026. And in this recording, I'm going to be doing a partial read-through of a piece by Dan Kagan-Kans. It was published in Informer magazine, or perhaps it's a Substack, which is titled The Left is Missing Out on AI. So on February 17th of 2026, Dutch historian, writer, and TED Talk fan Rutger Bregman, author of, among other things, the book Utopia for Realists, interesting title, posted the following to his Bluesky account, praising an essay by the journalist Dan Kagan-Kans, which, as I mentioned, is titled The Left is Missing Out on AI. Bregman's post joined several others that algorithmically drifted onto my Bluesky timeline, singing the praises of this essay. Bregman's declaration that the essay was, quote, absolutely brilliant, end quote, stood out for being particularly hyperbolic. Kagan-Kans' essay joined a rogues gallery of essays with a similar, indeed nearly identical theme. AI is remarkable and transformative, and the left, put that in scare quotes, by opposing it, is somehow vaguely against that magical land, the future. I recorded a video about one of these essays by Evgeny Morozov, which you can find on this channel, and I wrote an essay in response to this article, published in 2025 in Jacobin by Holly Buck and Matt Huber. Now, I use a simple criteria to assess these essays, which all make gigantic claims. The first question I ask is there a definition of AI? And I mean a technical definition, like what is it? Because we're talking about technology here. Second thing I look for is there a definition of the left? Because these people, these authors, are always talking about the left. But what is this left? Who do they mention as being part of this left? The third thing I look for is, does the author provide a grounded, material set of examples of the so-called AI in use? And finally, does the author depend on industry sources and talking points to make their argument? Kagan-Kans' essay is 4,451 words long. My God. One of the other tendencies of these "the left gets AI wrong" essays is wordiness. We live in an age that is sorely in need of editors. So instead of reading through this entire essay, which would be exhausting for you, certainly for me, I'm going to extract key excerpts and see how they measure against the criteria I mentioned earlier. So let's start with the first paragraph. And I did read through the whole thing, but my God, I'm not going to put you through an entire video in which I read the whole thing. You can put yourself through that. The first paragraph is headed with the word abdication, which gives you an idea of where Kagan-Kans is going. So he starts by saying that somehow and this was a quote, by the way, somehow all of the interesting energy for discussions about the long-range future of humanity is concentrated on the right, wrote Joshua Akim, head of mission alignment at OpenAI on X last year. The left has completely abdicated their role in this discussion. A decade from now, this will be understood on the left to have been a generational mistake, which is interesting because from the very beginning, there are grounds to dismiss this paragraph, but indeed the entire piece, because he's starting with a statement from an industry person who is making political claims, which, there's no way that those claims could be possibly motivated. And what in the world does this person who works for OpenAI, what could they possibly have to say about the left? If the term left means anything at all, it certainly would mean that it's not simply some corporate executive who may have some nice ideas or be okay with his daughter or son dating a black person, for example. That's typically the kind of weak definition that one gets from Americans. Anyway, by quoting an OpenAI expert who's trying to sell you something, well, I think that is indeed disqualifying. So from the very start, Kagan-Kans rather, is suspect. His argument is liable. In the next paragraph, Kagan-Kans continues with his vagaries and recall the criteria that I mentioned a little earlier, which was, does the author define the left? Well, here we can see the answer is no, because Kagan-Kans says, as a movement, it appears the left has not been willing to engage seriously with AI, despite its potential to affect the lives and livelihoods of billions of people in ways that would normally make it just the kind of threat and opportunity left politics would concern itself with, which is a very strange statement. And later, you will see that Kagan-Kans contradicts himself, because he actually lists a number of people, many of whom I would consider to be pretty solidly on the actual left, who are indeed criticizing, critiquing so-called AI, and are doing so on very detailed grounds. But he's saying that, no, the left is not concerning itself with this. So what does he mean here? What does he mean? What does he mean by the left? And what does he mean by people not engaging with it? And then in this other section that you see here that's been highlighted, he lists some of the objections, but he just calls them as a mix of reasons that are good and bad. Well, what are the good reasons and what are the bad reasons? This entire section, well, the entire piece is actually quite vague, but this section sets us up for kind of a parade of vagaries, because it's just a series of general statements that are presented as if they are very carefully crafted arguments. And this is a theme, once again, of these, the left is missing out on AI type pieces. We don't get a definition of artificial intelligence. We don't actually get a history of it. We don't get a review of the technical aspects of it. And we are talking about machinery. We are talking about software running on computers in data centers. We cannot speak in vague terms about it. Well, I say we cannot. Obviously we can, because these people do it all the time. But what's offensive is that they do it and then pretend as if they are making some sort of strong and detailed arguments. It's like critiquing, say, the manufacture of aircraft and then just talking about how exciting it is to fly. This takes us to the section that is headed with the phrase, or headed with the new consensus, in which Kagan-Kans describes, well, what he calls a new consensus among critics of so-called AI. And he lists some high-profile people such as Cory Doctorow. I have my problems with Doctorow, but he does make logical points from time to time. And among those points is about the nature of the so-called AI industry. He also mentions, Kagan-Kans that is, also mentions Bernie Sanders, that world-famous artificial intelligence and computer expert who, as part of his oligarchy shtick, has been talking about the tech industry. Sanders is a topic for another time, and probably not for this channel, but for some other venue. But the main thing about this section in the essay is that Kagan-Kans is doing something that I have seen in every single one of these essays, in which he lists a few critics, and more are to come later in the essay, you'll see. And then he sort of dismisses their critiques. And I think that this is done to appear as if he's being fair-minded. It's very similar to the kind of thing that major news outlets do, in which they try to be, as the phrase goes, fair and balanced. I'm going to say that climate change, I being, say, CNN, climate change is an issue, but let's also hear from ExxonMobil. We'll hear from a scientist, but we'll also hear from ExxonMobil to make sure that everyone's view is covered. Kagan-Kans does this all throughout this piece, and he's not alone, because as I mentioned, others who have written these kinds of pieces, like the Jacobin piece by Holly Buck and Matt Huber, And other pieces, this is what they do repeatedly, which is weave into their pieces criticisms and then dismiss them. In other words, they don't actually take them seriously. So it's like saying, hey, did you know that data centers are responsible for a tremendous amount of emissions, CO2 emissions? And then coming up with some excuse as to why that's not important. So that way, you cannot be accused of ignoring a problem. It's quite clever, actually, as a tactic. Now, in this next part of the consensus section, Kagan-Kans dives into what he means by consensus, which is that the consensus view amongst critics of AI, and large language models in particular, is that they are nothing more than fancy, computationally and capital and ecologically expensive autocomplete machines. And he says that, he gives us a list, as you can see here on the screen, of the publications, such as the New Republic and the Nation and N+1 and the New York Review of Books, in which that view has been expressed by one author or the other. But Kagan-Kans says, well, wait a minute, that's not right. It's really a consensus, and it's only coming from academia, which is an astounding statement because the people who are making these statements, the sources of these statements, are actually scientists, engineers, technologists, people who know how the machinery works. Again, returning to my analogy of aircraft, it would be like someone, a journalist in this case, like Kagan-Kans, reading a document about why the Boeing 777 had all sorts of technical problems and then saying, well, yes, those technical problems existed, and the consensus is that the 777 has technical problems. However, Boeing says that the 777 does not have technical problems, and that's what I'm going to go with, because there's more to it than what the actual aeronautic engineers have to say. It's really quite audacious. Actually offensive as well, because there is a dismissal of the view of experts, and I cannot help but notice that almost all of these experts are indeed women. What connections can we make here? We have a journalist who is not a technologist, not a scientist, not even a technician. Maybe he does spreadsheets, I don't know. But he is not a person who works with this technology in a data center, as a scientist, as a researcher, in any capacity. Just saying, no, we shouldn't pay attention to the autocomplete view because it doesn't agree with what the industry is saying and what I think may be happening. It's amazing. All right, so in this next section, which is a continuation of what we were talking about, I'm going to read more or less everything because Kagan-Kans begins an attempt, I'll say, to critique the work of scientist and linguist Emily Bender, who has been who is, I should say, a strong and consistent and powerful critic of the AI narrative. So let's read. This is a quote from Dr. Bender. If you take the phrase artificial intelligence in a sentence like, does AI understand, or can AI help us make better decisions, and you replace it with maths or SALAMI, an acronym for systematic approaches to learning, algorithms, and machine inferences, it's immediately obvious how ridiculous it is. Does the SALAMI understand? Kagan-Kans responds by saying the following. The above is from Emily Bender, a University of Washington computational linguist, and the person probably most responsible for the autocomplete view and its adoption in left circles. Except she gives it another name, the stochastic parrots hypothesis, which explains the impression of intelligence that LLMs offer in the immediately graspable image of a bird that talks but doesn't know anything. This was a stroke of mimetic genius. The 2021 paper it was coined for, written by Bender with Timnit Gebru, Angelina McMillan Major, and Margaret Mitchell, has been cited around 8,000 times. From there, it's echoed through the Nation and N+1, Bluesky, sometimes without attribution. In 2023, when chatbots were more than a toy, AI as autocomplete was maybe a defensible position. But now, maybe a defensible position, Kagan-Kans says. So he's citing this work and the famous stochastic parrots paper by Bender, the other co-authors that he lists, Margaret Mitchell, Macmillan Major, Timnit Gebru. He cites them, but then he says maybe they were right, maybe, but are they right now? Now, one might think that scientists, who've written about the topic, might be aware of the state of the art. They just might. But according to Kagan-Kans, a journalist, mind you, maybe they're not right. Kagan-Kans' challenge to the idea that large language models are essentially extremely costly versions of autocomplete or stochastic parrots is to claim that scale is all you need. And also that reinforcement learning with human feedback has somehow catapulted the field beyond what it was in 2023 when the paper came out. Let me just read for you this section that's highlighted here on your screen. Yet the properties of scale do not often enter the left conversation, nor do several other factors. Factors such as the likelihood that training a system to predict across millions of different cases forces it to build representations of the world that then, even if you want to reserve the word understanding for beings that walk around talking out of mouths, produce outputs that look a lot like understanding. Or that reserving words like understanding for humans depends on eliding the fact that nobody agrees on what it or intelligence or meaning actually mean. And that if you're arguing for human uniqueness, you need to show that the trillions of neuron connections in the brain aren't also doing next token prediction or something like it. And no, you don't, because you don't have to demonstrate, for example, that the sun is not a giant burning rock to propose a theory of nuclear fusion as it applies to stellar bodies. But also note here how Kagan-Kans attempts to walk into the realm of cognitive science. Let me remind you, this man is a journalist. I am not saying that journalists cannot study and learn and become well-versed lay people in a particular subject. However, the first thing that's required to be an intelligent layperson is to listen to experts, yeah? And this is not what Kagan-Kans is doing here. He's actually making a statement, challenging the assessments of experts. There's also a material aspect to this, which is implicit support for the unlimited data center growth, a project, of course, of the tech industry. Because what does scale mean in material terms? It means building more and more and more data centers. And what does reinforcement learning mean? Well, reinforcement learning with human feedback means humans labeling data primarily, as you see in this example from Kenya. And is scale all you need? I think that the industry, or rather the scientific consensus, is that no, it's not. It's not working. Even Gary Marcus, with whom I have some problems, or with whom I have some problems in terms of his behavior, as long ago as 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, made the case, rather strong technical case, that scale was indeed insufficient to build intelligence. It's really quite astounding here, the hubris, the arrogance that's on display in this piece, which I remind you, our friend, Dutch economist and writer Bregman said had written an absolutely brilliant piece. That is to say, he stated that Kagan-Kans' piece was, quote, absolutely brilliant. And yet this is what we get. At this point, we are not even halfway through this over 4,000 word document. And so far, we still haven't really heard any clear definition of artificial intelligence. no clear definition of the left. And we've witnessed Kagan-Kans attempting to debunk, as it were, the statements of experts whose ideas and whose assessments do not align with his own. So, rather than continuing to just slog through, let's skip ahead a bit because there's just a lot of the same within this supposedly, quote, absolutely brilliant, end quote, essay. Let's skip ahead to some key areas and to the denouement, as it were. Once again, Kagan-Kans attempts to debunk Bender. Let me read this entire passage. Here, Bender is again the way to understanding. And by understanding, Kagan-Kans is talking about understanding the counter view to the idea that AI is on its way to intelligence. Her view of AI is based on a firm belief about the nature of knowledge that comes from her work in linguistics. Quote, the language modeling task, because it only uses form as training data, cannot in principle lead to learning of meaning, end quote. She writes in one paper, meaning basically that because LLMs are disembodied, they cannot connect words to the things in the world they describe, which is a problem, since connecting words to things is the essence of meaning. The key term in that claim is, quote, in principle, end quote. It means that no amount of improvement in LLM ability could ever change the claim. And indeed, as LLMs have improved, Bender has shown little sign of altering her view. Where is this improvement? Anyway, let's move on to the highlighted bit here. This description of how AI works is, in other words, more a philosophical definition than an empirical description. Again, I remind you, the journalist challenging the actually existing linguist. That's why the main energy of her work lately is to reframe, to drag things from one process, or rather from process and output, back to philosophy. That's why, quote, understanding, end quote, becomes, quote, parroting, end quote. Neural networks become mathy-maths. LLMs become synthetic text extruding machines. She who best changes the terms wins the debate is the approach, and Bender has in many ways done just that. Let me pause here to just wonder, why is it that Kagan-Kans seems to have a stick up his ass about Dr. Bender? I'm just very curious about that, because he seems to spend an inordinate amount of time challenging her view. Earlier, only a few moments ago, I talked about Gary Marcus, who's a scientist and who also has challenged the standard view of what large language models are. Marcus is proposing a hybrid architecture using neurosymbolic systems along with LLMs, which is probably something similar to what is happening with DeepSeek, although DeepSeek, I think, is also using an updated version of expert systems. But that geekery aside, back to the point, why is Kagan-Kans spending so much time trying to take apart Dr. Bender's arguments? It's very suspicious to me, particularly since he is completely out of his depth. Anyway, let me continue reading here. Of course, that, quote, can mathematics help us make better decisions, end quote, is a perfectly cogent question, to which the answer is almost certainly yes, shows the limits of this approach. How is the answer almost certainly yes? Kagan-Kans has not demonstrated, has not proved, has not shown in an architecture, has not shown in any way in this document a path, a reason to support that statement. He's simply dropping it out there. And now we get to Kagan-Kans' end, or rather to the end of his essay, in which he sums it all up. He brings it all together, brings it all home, so to speak. Let's read. As for the far or more exotic futures, what's the best shape to universal basic income if it's needed? What if it's wanted? Can treaties be designed to slow a race to superintelligence and reduce the risk of a catastrophe? What is the ethical view of post-humanism? Hardly any on the left is considering these questions in ways worth agreeing or disagreeing with. Aaron Bastani, the hard left British journalist, is one exception. His 2019 book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, envisions the ways technological development could eventually abolish material scarcity and free humanity from toil. Quote, the demand would be a 10 or 12-hour working week, a guaranteed social wage, universally guaranteed housing, education, healthcare, and so on, end quote, he said in 2015. Far from revealing a thrall to capitalism, these attributes reflect a belief in industrial power that goes all the way back to Karl Marx. All the way back to Karl Marx. Except Marx, towards the end of his life, and Engels certainly, began to acknowledge something called the metabolic rift. That is to say, the impact that capitalism and capitalist activities were having on nature. And by having on nature, we're therefore having the impact that capitalist activities were having on the prospects for humanity to flourish, maybe to even survive. So to say, and this is another thing that the left is missing out on AI bros. I just say bros because it's pretty much all women, all men at this point, isn't it? This is what they also say repeatedly. Those who claim to be on the left, which is that, well, Marx would approve of this. You know, that's really beside the point. What a genuine Marxist would do would be to apply historical and dialectical materialism to the question of what is happening right now with this technology. It would be to apply a method and not quotes. Aaron Bastani's book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, is absurd. And also, it's based upon, as is the argument of Kagan-Kans, based upon the idea that we should simply allow capitalist entities to continue to ravage the earth because eventually they will morph into some kind of socialist utopia. It's really a quite disgusting view. And it's interesting because at the beginning of this essay, Kagan-Kans uses the word abdication to describe what the left is allegedly doing or not doing. But it's really this entire class of writers and thinkers who have abdicated their ability and really their duty to think. They are simply taking press releases from the corporations, applying, or rather throwing, thousands of words like radar chaff to disguise actual purposes, to confuse people. It is a form of counterinsurgency against our ability to properly assess what is happening with this industry. Kagan-Kans' essay, and all the essays like it, use a three-pronged approach. The first part of the first thing they do is to state a false problem. The left is missing out on AI. Stage 2 is to pretend to take critique seriously while undermining it subtly. And the third part of their attack is to close their piece by repeating industry talking points, for example, superintelligence, and that while referencing Marx as cover. You see, I'm on the left, I'm quoting Karl Marx. So you don't have to actually assess what I say, just pay attention to the fact that I just threw Marx in there. Every single piece that makes this argument or some variation of this argument uses this pattern. It's like clockwork. 4,000 words, over 4,000 words, actually, and all to sum it up to mean that missing out, according to Kagan-Kans, means refusing to accept the industry's sales pitches and propaganda. That's all missing out means. The left is missing out because it's not accepting, or what there is of a left, but leftists who are critical are not accepting what, say, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, and so on are saying. But you see, Kagan-Kans and people like him do. Therefore, they're not missing out in his view. They are embracing the future. At the beginning of this video essay, I asked 4 questions, or rather, I proposed 4 questions as the criteria for assessing, for judging essays like this. Is there a definition of AI in the essay? Is there a definition of the left? Does the author provide grounded material examples? And does the author depend on industry sources and talking points to make their argument? Well, although the answer to the last one is yes, I think we can conclude that the answer to the other three is a resounding no. As I mentioned earlier in this video essay, we are seeing a lot of these pieces, a lot of these what the left is missing out on with regards to AI, allegedly, pieces. And because they just seem to come like rocks tumbling down a hill, the question we have to ask ourselves is why? Why continue to respond to these documents? Because people keep writing them and we keep responding. It seems to be an endless circle. Why continue to do it? Well, I'd say that those of us who know better and who are willing to speak up have a duty because of socio-political reasons, a duty because of ecological reasons, and also a duty because to retain our ability to think, we need to resist. Resist the urge to surrender, but also resist the attack that's being waged, the war really that's being waged against human thought. Here's a quote from H.L. Mencken that I want to use, which I think is appropriate here. H.L. Mencken, the famous, for some infamous American early to mid 20th century journalist and writer who was quite ruthless in his critiques of the United States and of fools in general. Let's read. Of a piece with the absurd pedagogical demand for so-called constructive criticism is the doctrine that an iconoclast is a hollow and evil fellow unless he can prove his case. Why indeed should he prove it? Is he judge, jury, prosecuting officer, hangman? He proves enough indeed when he proves by his blasphemy that this or that idol is defectively convincing, that at least one visitor to the shrine is left full of doubts. The fact is enormously significant. It indicates that instinct has somehow risen superior to the shallowness of logic, the refuge of fools. The pedant and the priest have always been the most expert of logicians, and the most diligent disseminators of nonsense and worse. The liberation of the human mind has never been furthered by dunderheads. It has been furthered by gay fellows who heaved dead cats into sanctuaries and then went roistering down the highways of the world, proving to all men that doubt, after all, was safe, that the God in the sanctuary was finite in his power, and hence a fraud. One horse laugh is worth 10,000 syllogisms. It is not only more effective, it is also vastly more intelligent. Never let anyone tell you that by being an iconoclast against the consensus view that so-called AI is intelligent and is taking over the world and there's nothing we can do about it. Never let that stop you. Thank you for listening, and hope you're doing well.